On the point of financing, which I really appreciate, and yeah, and you're right, Chair Marcus. It seems to be at the end. In fact, we have a 10 action plan, and
It's always the last one.
action number 10. But it's really
Fortunately, we already got $7.5 billion, so at least we got a down payment.
And just to remind folks, I remember the 07-08 drought, which was talked about a bit today. There was a lot of criticism of our water agencies folks, not very well deserved necessarily, but Mr. Weston touched on it, that despite the fact that a lot of good work has been done to develop rates that are sensitive to trying to incentivize conservation and keep fiscal stability for the agencies, we still struggle. I appreciate all the work even the last few years since '09 to try to right that ship, and I get and I support that input about the state, whether us or DWR in partnership, being a clearinghouse for those tools as they develop. But are we going to run into the same problem again? Where our drought pricing creativity is still not figured this out, maybe for all the agencies. Some are more fiscally sound than others. But I continue to be concerned about the fiscal stability element of the water agency structure as we have it today. Whether, many municipalities take this on. Sometimes they're water districts, sometimes multi-sector water districts. But in the end, I'm not sure if we're robust enough yet to withstand what we're going through now and be fiscally resilient. So I think the discussion about the funding needs to continue in terms of having that safety net that we need for true resiliency in the face of a drought cycle that I think is changing. Yes, we have wet cycles and drought cycles, but there's also climate change hovering behind this. So I look forward to learning more and getting more information and serving that function at the state level that becomes reliable data that's reproducible and comparable. I think we've, as a team with stakeholders, accomplished a lot in last year, and I hope in this arena we can contribute as well. Thanks.
Well, I just want to compliment staff. I learned a lot today. This was terrific, and I think we could be here for several days, and there would still be lots more to learn. So I'm going to limit my comments. I don't feel that I'm an expert, but I would just put them in two categories. One is low-hanging fruit and stuff that hopefully with the good advice that we receive from the panelists we could do in the short term. This idea about providing technical assistance on peaking and characteristics that could be used, a sort of a standard evaluation on residential class, and then anything we can do to help on the broader issues on science-based information that districts could use. I like the idea of a clearinghouse. But at the same time, if there's this tension here, I like, Dave Bolin, what you said, that it's local, and Mark Weston also, that we really need to be considering that one size does not fit all. But the other side of me says, and that's why I was asking these questions earlier today, I would like to see a map. I think that the area where I reside, and I'm talking about a broad area, there's not a lot that's being done. So we're hearing from a lot of folks that have, they've paved the way. They've paved the way for others. And then for those others that have not acted, why haven't they acted? Have they not acted because they don't have that technical assistance? They don't have the financial capacity? Or they're thinking about other things, and this is just, too difficult? I know they attend aqua conferences and all that, but what's the missing piece? And whether it's us providing technical assistance through this sort of low-hanging fruit path, or do we need to act bold? And if we do need to be more bold, I don't think we should be afraid to do that. We've got a lot of big issues that need to be grappled with. And if that's the case, then Michael, we're counting on you and others to advise us as far as our legal authorities, what we can do as a board, and if not, what we can do to complement the actions of others. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go back to John Mills, followed by Tom Viersick.
Madam Chair, members of the board, I'm kind of hobbling today. I've got a knee brace on, so if I seem to be listing to one side, that's why. I would like to jump back to Lester Snow's comments earlier. I represent a number of upstream water agencies, basically starting at Lake Tahoe and going down to the valley floor and anything in between, West Slope, Sierra systems. I think we need to think about conservation in a broad policy setting to begin with, and then work our way down. The time frame we should be looking at in a policy setting ought to be at least 20 years, and not just this year. Everything happens over a long period of time in the water industry. It happens that way in nature, and we need to look ahead at least that time frame. The subject matter has to be more expansive rather than just the end user. I appreciate the focus on the end user and getting everybody down to a certain number of gallons per capita per day, but compared to the inefficiencies in the rest of the hydrologic cycle, that's small potatoes. And I don't mean that to disparage the end user conservation. I just need to point out that climate change is here. It's already happening. And the system isn't working the way it was 30 years ago. It isn't working the way it was 10 years ago. And as I said in the Delta Challenges Forum of a few months ago, it's changing faster than we can keep up with it. So to get ahead of that, we have to move out strategically. The value of water is not in question. I've got clients who are delivering it by truck. That's an expensive way to deliver water in California, especially when you have to go up and down hills, which we have in the Sierras. The Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project report was done over 20 years ago by the U.S. Congress. I was the aqua liaison to that report. And if you combined grazing and mining and timber and recreation, they were about half the value of water in the Sierras. So the question of how valuable water is a moot question. It's the most valuable resource we have in our headwaters, and we have to start treating it that way. Any state-imposed fee, because I've heard the discussion of fees, should protect that broad spectrum. It ought to cover all of those opportunities in the hydrologic cycle. The efficiency has to begin there, and we have to recognize in terms of investment that we can change the timing of runoff, the quality of runoff, and the amount of runoff. All of those things are things that directly benefit downstream water agencies, and there is a logical nexus there for investment. The State Water Resource Control Board's role in this ought to be to support stakeholder groups that are already underway and working with each other. Those of us in the water industry are trying to do that right now, but it's a little hard during a drought year when you're dealing with all kinds of things that are occurring this year and last year, but we're trying. Provide us with a forum. This is an excellent forum. Your workshops are great. They get public exposure, they get the media's attention, and they allow us a place to vet some of our ideas and get peer review on those ideas with panels of experts that are up here. I think that it can help us direct technical expertise and resources where most needed. We should coordinate with other state agencies too. I think the state board has a role to bring in their sister agencies to try to develop some common ground. I point out DWR, who does our state water plan, does our SBX 77 requirements, urban water management planning. OPR, which has a role in this because I believe there is something of a nexus between land use and water supply. And the Delta Stewardship Council, who under Water Code Section 85021 is supposed to improve regional self-sufficiency and reduce reliance on the Delta, which are two outcomes of conservation. The scale of assistance should vary. I think we should be looking at regional settings. And one of the places we have some really great synergy and energy is in integrated regional water management programs. And so if we could direct some of those resources in a regional setting, I think we'd get it out to the local agencies much quicker. We also have pretty good cross-section there of federal agencies, state agencies, tribes, local governments, water agencies. It's a really good mix in those IRWM programs. You know, some of our meetings are very exciting. And I mean that in a good way. We also should use the local assemblage that we have in our local agencies. All my folks are members of AQUA, and I'm required to say at this point, saveourwater.com. Now I get a free drink at the annual conference. I also want to ask that the state board should provide a validation of some of the things we're doing. We talked about the administrative record earlier. court proceeding, I'd also like to ask if we could get that here as we begin to move forward with ideas on conservation pricing. Having the state and your sister agencies weigh in on some of these things and validate that could help us if we have to on the legislative side as well, but certainly it could help us in an administrative record to point
Well,
back to some
and
of these.
locally as well. I mean, one of the things we've
Absolutely.
said, it's less so today, is that we want to have agencies' backs on this stuff to the extent we can. So that also counts at a local level. We can't be at 400 or more places every day all at once, but certainly when asked, we can help provide support.
Done a good job. You're at about 398 of them, I think.
I'm really tired right now.
We are, at local agencies, we're trying to learn. We're trying to learn from other agencies. I'm doing a lot of work with a lot of the agencies down south because they're doing such a great job down there on this, and we really want to learn from them. I'm out of time, so I can't say anything more good about them. But they're doing a great job, and I, in fact, had lunch with Dune Lopez from Moulton Niguel and Greg Weber from Cook, and we talked about some of this stuff, and we really would like to learn from them, take advantage of their technical expertise, take advantage of those resources, and try and find some partnerships available. Because I have yet to talk to a general manager or any of my agencies who thinks that conservation pricing is not a good idea. I have yet to talk to one of my general managers of any of my agencies who has the technical expertise, the money, the time to do it right now. So it's not for one a good idea. And so I think I maybe answered Dee Dee's earlier question is why aren't you doing it? Other than time, money, and technical expertise, we're right on top of this. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have, but thank you very much for this workshop today. It was valuable.
And thank you for flagging that upper watershed issue, which I think is one of the more exciting long-term issues that we need to be dealing with. We've danced around it, but the idea of us providing a forum is something we should be talking with our sister agencies about who are more on point on that. I know Aqua has just asked for some support with their new coalition dealing with it, and we're happy to be helpful if you think this is a good forum for panels and the like.
Of the headwaters, I suggest August is a great month to get out of Sacramento. Let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Piercing.
Good afternoon, Chair Marcus and remaining board members. My name is Tom Versick from the Office of Patrick Maloney. We submitted, Okay. We submitted a short comment letter. And I submitted my speaker card late in the day because I really didn't think I had much to say about the things. There are very useful, interesting things being raised. But I do have a couple of points with a couple of caveats at the beginning. One is that I come here in a slightly different position than apparently most of the other speakers, which is I've represented ratepayers, not rate makers. I was counsel and I was on the appeal in the Morgan case, for example. And the other part of that, little implicit, is that I've dealt with urban water, not urban, but agricultural water agencies. So I have nothing remotely specific to offer about the urban agencies. I'm going to be agnostic about that piece. But there's a couple of things I heard or didn't hear or misheard, perhaps. One is one of the phrases is resiliency of the state, of the water, of our water system. Those are wonderful. But there seems to be an implication that there needs to be a resiliency of the local agencies, that we can't have less local agencies, or they can't change their structure, or they can't operate differently. I mean, again, this is implicit, something I seem to be picking up, perhaps not accurately. And so with that in mind, what I've also haven't heard is the term engagement. Maybe I did, but I hear education, that you have to educate the ratepayers. Our position is you have to engage the ratepayers. You really have to have a contract. You have to have a back and forth, not just find the, and here's another term, safe harbor. That sounds potentially dangerous because if you have a safe harbor, in at least the experiences I've had with my set of clients, then there are some agencies that will do exactly the safe harbor and do nothing with the ratepayers. And that's a bad idea, long-term wise. And in the bottom line is that the Constitution says the ratepayers do have some options around the agencies. And if, in the worst case, if the agencies fail, then you all, the governor, some other entities, can force them to do things. And then those agencies will probably change their structure. They'll change their acronyms. They'll become something else down the road. These are all options. These should be on the table. And the reason for that is because you want to be able to have innovation. You want technology. You don't want a status quo, safe place where nothing changes. You just find the correct way the way that appears correct to do it, and you don't change anything else. And I'm going to give a small example, just a small, actually two, and they're in our letter, but one is that the Monterey County Water Resources Agency had an amazingly successful process 10 or 15 years ago. This was post Proposition 218. They went out for their first 218 vote, possibly the first agency that did it. I didn't pay much attention at the time whether they were genuinely the first ones, but very early they failed miserably. Then they engaged, and they got a really good outcome. And you can quibble whether the project's good or bad, but their outcome was great. In contrast, the Morgan case, which I heard my colleagues speak of, and I would characterize it rather differently, which is not terribly important except that from my perspective, it was about a bait and switch. It wasn't that there couldn't be a raising of water rates, it's whether the rates on the notice should be the same as in the cost of service, should be the same as what the board approves, and judges came to conclusions about those things. And my clients got the relief they needed to get in the appellate opinion about that they couldn't go out of the record to raise rates again. So these things work out, eventually. So I would caution you to look at it a little bit more broadly. I mean, many things people have talked about are great, really good policy perspectives, and especially the reasonable to prohibit waste and to have reasonable water use. I mean, that's got to be the bottom line, period, no matter who you are, what kind of agency you are. But I do, to me, from my perspective here, a little too much emphasis on let's make sure these agencies stay fiscally healthy, make sure they stay the same, and that nothing changes. Thank you.
No, thank you, and thank you for bringing that up. I think it's funny, there's a lot in words that people use. I think the intent, if I'm channeling Steve, but also the discussion, is not to have agencies unable to do conservation pricing such that they actually resist conservation, because the only way they can bring in money is not to use that kind of pricing. That's part of the feature here, but I totally agree with you on the engagement issue. I think it's a sea change and a cultural change that happened in the garbage industry 20 or 30 years ago. It happened in the energy arena 20 or 30 years ago, and I think water's just a little later to the party in a way that in some agencies folks have engaged and shared, and in others they haven't had to. And with the thousands of agencies we have, not just the 400, it's as varied as the number of agencies. Some are stellar and some are sort of closely held, and the only way to raise rates and get support is going to be through sharing information and engaging exactly the public.
And I too appreciate that your perspective, and I think you bring up a very important point that really we didn't deal with here, and that we probably need to do more on, and that is, how do you evaluate over time that you are in fact keeping up with the state of the art, if you will, of providing water, that you're using the technologies that are important. We heard several mentions of the cost of dealing with leaks by using some new, fairly, or not, actually it's not that new, but new-ish, sophisticated technology systems. Well, not everyone is using those, and we probably have a lot of leaks out there. Exactly. And so, where is the accountability for keeping up with the times, if you will? And we're dealing with conservation right here, but really we're talking about water management into a very uncertain future that is going to need to be much more flexible, much more creative, and maybe we're just going to have to look at the cost issue, but efficiency is going to have to be in there too. Efficiency of the use of the monies that ratepayers are paying, and we're getting into that a lot within the Water Board on cost effectiveness and efficiencies, and looking at outcomes
before, as we are also looking at costs. So I think you raise a good point, and I think it is something we will want to explore in the future.
Before I turn to my colleagues, I want to turn back to Mr. Laufer, Mr. Gomberg, Mr. Polimas, if there's anything you wanted to say before we give you some thoughts.
I think the comments that I used in closing with my panel really are where I come out on this. There isn't a magic silver bullet. We're going to have to look at all the different things we can do to assist local agencies, to assist ratepayers in understanding the importance and how these pieces fit together. And when I say assist the local agencies, it's assist them in compliance with Proposition 218, but also assist them with the very important function that the board is trying to promote in responding to this drought, which is conserving a precious resource to expand our local water supplies, because we simply don't know how long this will continue.
Woman in green speaks.
The one blue, or brown, I guess, since brown is the new green.
No, gold is the new green too. You have two choices.
Oh, okay. I might look better in gold than brown. I just want to thank everyone and thank staff for putting together a very informative session, and everyone who came and participated today, as well as provided the many written comments that I still need to go through. I'm curious, though, and maybe I'm looking at Max or Eric on this, but given that we've heard and have received so many good suggestions, what is the path forward? What are some of the things that staff is thinking in terms of a process going forward? I mean, obviously, we need to go through and, review at least for me, review the comments in more thorough detailness. And there'll be some exchanges, obviously not between us unless it's at a public forum, but with staff. But I don't want us to walk away from this very productive day without at least some ideas of what the next steps are, both in terms of getting back to the board with some further discussions or proposals, but also in terms of staff's perhaps proposal to engage or respond to some of the comments that we've heard and get some feedback from various stakeholders. We've heard some speakers today volunteer to help us and to get engaged in some, sort of a advisory or technical type committee. And I don't know if staff is thinking about that or not. So I'm curious from staff's perspective, how do you propose to line up the next steps in bringing something back to us for discussion, besides from just individually meeting with us?
Well, I think first of all, and Max can certainly augment this, I think from the legal and technical staff perspective, we need to sit down. We've heard some ideas today that were a little bit different, and we heard a lot of things that I think have been kicked around both within the Water Board technical and legal staff, as well as within the administration more broadly, but we heard some finer points put on them. And I think we'll probably sit down internally and kind of map out the entire spectrum of options and the ones that we think are the best to discuss with you all. And I expect that will, be informed by individual board member briefings. When I look at the challenge of implementing Directive 8, and when I listen to the testimony today, I mean, one thing we have been consistent in our messaging, and you heard it from representatives of local water agencies today, water pricing is very local. There are so many variables that go into the decisions of the local water agencies when they set their rate structures and develop their rate structures that I do not see any scenario whereby there is some sort of monolithic response from the State Water Board that results in a statewide directive. I see a progressive implementation of the directive. We've already started by building out a website that has some basic tools. We heard some great ideas today from some of the economists and some of the consultants in this area, and I expect us to further flesh out some of those tools so that those are near-term actions we can take. People can immediately begin using them. One of the things that you've heard both today and from us is that we have kind of twin objectives for that 1/3 of agencies that have not yet adopted some form of conservation price structure. We want to make sure that they have the legal and technical path forward to do that, because as you heard consistently, I don't think there was a speaker today that said that you do not get a good conservation signal from a well-developed conservation rate structure. And so, we really want to promote, consistent with the governor's directive, the uniform, or not uniform, but we want to promote the adoption of those rate structures in those remaining 1/3 of the agencies. But then there was that second component of, what can we do to assist those agencies that have already adopted rate structures, ensure that they can defend them if they are lawful and appropriate under Proposition 218. And there was an interesting idea put forward today about them being able to essentially supplement, and ratify their existing rate structure with new information that the board comes up with, or that they might develop based on new rate studies. And so I think, trying to identify those tools, those will all be things in the short term. There's a larger discussion that several of you alluded to with respect to the legislative framework, and obviously we don't speak on legislative matters. That is a decision for the administration and the governor's office to make. But certainly trying to inform them and tee up issues today. There was, well, it's a little bit beyond, if you will, the conservation pricing directive. There were several commenters today that invoked the concept of a public goods charge, and that is a larger discussion to have within the administration. So I kind of see pulling this huge ball of wax together and trying to come up with a range of options for you. That will be the sequence of briefings. And then I expect that later this summer, there will be interim actions we will do, like I said, continuing to build a toolkit. But later this summer, we may have another public meeting where we can fine-tune specific proposals for actions and then get more targeted comments on those proposals. And Max, I don't know if there's anything you want to add beyond that.
Actually, before Max respond, it occurs to me that, amongst the many suggestions that have been brought up today, like Dee, I like the idea of a clearinghouse and, gathering case studies. And so I'm a thought to throw out. We're very fortunate to have reports from staff at every board meeting in terms of the drought and in terms of our conservation rates. And that might be used as a way to, I think, prioritize or at least identify our near-term options. So especially, after we get the information on the June, water usage and hopefully conservation rates, I would be very interested in knowing, based on the June data, for those agencies that, were very successful, what kind of rate structures they had in place, how long, and whether that contributed, and as well as for those who are not as successful, what are some of, what are their rate structure, what are some of the things or tools that they would need. And so rather than just, lumping everything into a huge ball that we need to tackle, perhaps one way to prioritize it is to focus on compliance with the conservation regulations that we adopted.
As I mentioned yesterday, we are now, with the June reporting, collecting data on what actions water suppliers have taken to comply with the conservation standards and the current regulation, and that includes rates. Probably not at the level of detail that you're talking about, Board Member Dodek, but we could do that.
And obviously, this would be something that would be done in collaboration with those agencies.
Of course. Just
Yeah, I think you may well find there are some that are taking a bath because of having stepped up to do the conservation that we required them to do. And part of this is also trying to help them recover.
Just to briefly add to what Michael said, I think it's clear we heard a lot of good ideas today about where the board could act, and probably fairly quickly in the realm of data collection, in the realm of certain types of technical assistance. And then, of course, there are the larger discussions that Michael alluded to about not so much the rates side, but the pricing side of things that have to take place at the administration level.
Yeah, that all sounds good. Just a few thoughts that I would toss into it. One thing I would really like to say, it does take a village, and so as you work to try and map this out, please meet with our good colleagues at DWR who've been working on these things longer than we have and have a lot of data and a lot of that. The drinking water division that has all kinds of superpowers that we didn't realize we had until they came. You can get them a cape or something, to reward them. But teeing up the choices are good, and then figuring out it's not all one big report. I like the idea of doing things in sort of in bites that we can handle, but I actually do think at some point some sort of a report, not a giant thing, but some written things that memorialize some of the things that seem apparent after sitting here all day that may give some comfort to some agencies. It may not resolve their fear of litigation or their fear of class actions. That issue is one that's probably beyond us. But there may be some people who take comfort and do something that they really can do with some cover, as well as, being willing to help individual agencies as they go to try and do this to the extent we can. I mean, we don't have 1 million people, but to the extent we can show up and help, I think we should be, I'm always happy to do that. I think my colleagues are as well. So to the extent we can be helpful even in that more informal way, I think we should be. And I do like that if you all have so many work groups to pull together as we move forward in case it doesn't rain next year, and we're going to do longer term rules. And I know you haven't forgotten that. It's just first things first, and those are going to be important longer term conversations. But I did kind of like the idea of pulling, some lawyers together, which I know you've already been doing, and figuring out whether there's a comfort at putting some best practices out, using our website as a vehicle, linking with Aqua as well, and, the Urban Water Conservation Council and the CUWCC, right, which I can never, Greg Weber, his group, just to figure out how to have those conversations so that we're all sort of figuring this out together, I think would be helpful too. I mean, that base touching is important to me before you come back, because there are a lot of good minds out there.
Certainly, and I think one of just given the way that Directive 8 came down, and because of the pending nature of the San Juan Capistrano decision at that time, the legal group got started pretty early. But I know from his work at the PUC and in general, Max has been engaged on some of the more economic sides of this. And with the speakers today, I think we've already got a foundation for those groups. And certainly anything as we start to move forward with recommendations to all of you, we will be vetting it past those established groups and reaching out more broadly, I think, because we've got to, from the people who took the time to submit comments and to appear before you today outside of the panel context to provide their public comments, to the extent that we intrude into areas that they raise, we can certainly reach out to them as well.
And some focus on the disadvantaged community issue that came up. I like the comment that you stumbled into a California water policy conference along the way. There was a lot that was, but it's all connected, so it was all interesting and I think all important. But there's some issues in there where I think we could also, we're already doing some things, but we could perhaps do even more. And there's a part of me that's tempted to go call one of the Joel and John or Howard, just call folks and say you couldn't have possibly meant lifeline rate. So what, you might actually get some agreement with them on some of this stuff as well. So, all right. With that, I'll just add my thanks to staff and to all the people who came, sharing stories, sharing concerns, sharing best practices, sharing, hopes, fears, et cetera. It actually was a very good conversation through great days, and I exceeded my expectations, and thank you for teeing it up so well. Great, thanks. Have a nice day. Meeting is adjourned.